When a young black girl approached a soldier saying, "You're my dad," the room froze. What came next revealed painful truths, a history of heartbreak, and the power of family to break barriers of racism and misunderstanding, leaving everyone in tears. The evening sun cast a warm orange hue over the bustling military base as Sergeant Michael Hayes stepped into the cafeteria. His uniform, crisp and clean, reflected years of dedication and sacrifice. Michael had seen his fair share of challenges in his 2-decade-long service, missions in war zones, months away from family, and the weight of decisions that could change lives. Yet none of it could prepare him for what was about to happen. The cafeteria was alive with chatter and the clinking of utensils, but Michael's mind was elsewhere. He had spent the last week preparing for redeployment, a process he knew all too well. At 40 years old, he had given everything to his country. But something always felt missing. The family he had dreamed of one day building never materialized. He had convinced himself that his work and comrades were enough to fill that void. As he picked up a tray and moved toward an empty table, he noticed a young girl, no older than 8, standing near the entrance with hesitant eyes scanning the room. Her skin was a warm, rich brown, and her curly hair was pulled into 2 neat ponytails. She wore a simple pink dress that had clearly been mended more than once. Something about her struck him immediately, a sense of quiet determination in her small frame, as though she carried the weight of the world on her tiny shoulders. Michael furrowed his brow as she slowly began walking in his direction. The girl's steps were timid at first, but with each passing moment, her resolve seemed to grow. People around her paused their conversations, their eyes following her as she moved purposefully across the room. When she finally stopped in front of Michael, her big brown eyes met his. "Are you Sergeant Hayes?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, unsure of what to make of the situation. "Yes, I'm Sergeant Hayes," he said, his voice kind but cautious. The girl took a deep breath, clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper in her hands. Then, with a trembling voice that could barely contain her emotions, she said, "You're my dad." Time seemed to freeze. The room, once buzzing with life, fell into an almost eerie silence. Forks clattered onto plates, whispers erupted in hushed tones, and all eyes turned to the soldier and the little girl standing before him. Michael's heart stopped. He blinked, his mind racing to process what she had just said. I'm sorry, what?" he stammered, feeling his throat tighten. The girl held up the crumpled paper. "My mama, she told me to find you," she said, her voice cracking as tears welled up in her eyes. "She said you're my dad. This is a picture of you and her from before I was born." Michael hesitantly reached for the paper, his hands trembling. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a faded photograph. It showed a younger version of himself, in his early 20s, smiling alongside a beautiful black woman. They were at a park, sitting close together with laughter in their eyes. The memory hit him like a tidal wave. Her name was Camille. She had been his first love during a brief leave many years ago, a whirlwind romance he had cherished but ultimately let go of as duty called him back. As his gaze shifted from the photo to the girl standing before him, his chest tightened, and tears began to form in his eyes. Her features, her nose, her eyes, even her stubborn little chin, were unmistakably his. Emotion surged through him in a way he couldn't control. The tough exterior he had spent years building as a soldier began to crumble. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees, looking up at her. I didn't know," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I didn't know about you." The girl's lip quivered, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. "Mama said you might not," she whispered, "but she told me you were a good man, and that I should find you." In that moment, the years of loneliness Michael had carried fell away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of guilt, love, and disbelief. He reached out, his hand trembling as it cupped her tiny cheek. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice soft and reverent. "Amara," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Amara," Michael repeated, as though saying her name made everything real. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as tears streamed down his face. The room around them seemed to disappear, leaving only a father and daughter united by a bond they never knew they shared. Little did Michael know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront the ghosts of his past, the complexities of race and identity, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Michael sat in the base commander's office that evening, the faded photo and Amara's tearful face still vivid in his mind. He clutched the edges of the photograph so tightly that it crumpled slightly in his hands. Outside the window, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the room. The weight of what had just happened bore down on him like the heavy rucksack he carried during his deployments. "Sergeant Hayes," the commander's voice broke the silence. Colonel Green was a weathered man with kind, steady eyes, who had seen decades of soldiers come and go, each carrying their own burdens. "Are you okay? You looked shaken earlier in the cafeteria." Michael exhaled deeply, staring down at the photo in his hands. "No, sir. I'm not okay," he admitted, his voice raw. "I just found out. I might have a daughter, an 8-year-old girl I didn't even know existed." The colonel raised his eyebrows but said nothing, waiting for Michael to continue. "I met her mother, Camille, years ago," Michael said, his voice distant as he was pulled back into the memory. "I was on leave and she was everything I didn't even know I needed. But when my orders came through, I had to go. I wrote to her once, but I never heard back. Life got in the way, and I didn't try hard enough." Words burned as he said them. He realized now how much he had buried his feelings under the rigid discipline of military life. The faces of his comrades, the sound of gunfire, and the focus of duty had always been his shield against the echoes of loneliness. And now this little girl, Amara, Michael continued, his voice breaking. "She walked right up to me and called me her dad. Sir, I've been to war, but nothing in my life has ever prepared me for that." Colonel Green nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're not the first soldier to face this, Hayes. Life in the service comes with sacrifices, but sometimes those sacrifices come back to you in ways you don't expect. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Michael didn't have an answer. What could he do? He had no idea how to be a father. For years he had avoided building a family because he feared the instability his career brought. Now, fate had handed him one. Later that night, as Michael sat on his bunk in the barracks, Amara's words replayed in his mind. "Mama said you might not know about me, but she told me you were a good man." Those words haunted him. Camille had trusted him enough to paint him as a figure of goodness in Amara's life. Despite his absence, guilt weighed heavy on his heart. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Michael opened it to see a base social worker, Sergeant Lauren Price, standing there with a clipboard. She was a no-nonsense woman with a compassionate edge. "Sergeant Hayes, I thought you might need this," she said, handing him a folder. "What's this?" he asked, flipping it open. "Information on Camille Richards," Lauren replied. "And Amara. I looked into their records after the incident in the cafeteria. It looks like Camille passed away about 3 months ago. Cancer." Michael's breath caught in his throat. The room spun for a moment, and he gripped the doorframe to steady himself. "She's gone?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lauren nodded solemnly. "Camille's sister, Tanya, has been taking care of Amara, but from what I understand, it hasn't been easy. Tanya lives paycheck to paycheck, and Camille's medical bills left them struggling to get by. That's probably why Amara showed up here today. She must have felt like she didn't have anywhere else to turn." Michael felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. Camille was gone. The woman he had once loved, the mother of his child, had faced her final battle alone. And now Amara, this innocent little girl, had been left to carry the weight of it all. "Do they live nearby?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. "About an hour away, in a small apartment complex downtown," Lauren replied. "If you want to visit her, I can arrange it. But Michael," she softened her tone, looking him in the eyes, "this little girl has been through a lot. If you're going to step into her life, you need to be ready for what that means." Michael swallowed hard, nodding. "I have to see her," he said with conviction. The next day, Michael drove down a quiet suburban street lined with faded houses and overgrown yards. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say, how he would explain his absence. The small apartment building where Tanya and Amara lived came into view. It was modest, with peeling paint and rusted railings, but there were signs of warmth. A small potted plant on the porch, a child's bike leaning against the wall. Michael parked his car and sat there for a moment, staring at the building. He felt like a soldier preparing for battle, only this time, there were no enemies, no weapons, just the unknown of meeting his daughter in her world. Finally, he stepped out of the car and walked up the steps. His heart pounded as he knocked on the door. A moment later, a woman in her late 30s opened it. She had tired eyes, but a warm smile. "You must be Michael," Tanya said, holding the door open. "Yes," Michael replied, clearing his throat. I wanted to see Amara." Tanya stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. The apartment was small but tidy, filled with photos of Camille and Amara. The sight of Camille's smiling face in the frames made Michael's chest ache. "Amara?" Tanya called softly. "There's someone here to see you." Moments later, Amara appeared from around the corner, clutching a stuffed animal. Her eyes lit up when she saw Michael, but there was hesitation too. Michael crouched down to her level, his voice soft. "Hi, Amara," he said. "I know we didn't get much time to talk yesterday, but I want to change that. I want to know you, and I want to be the dad you deserve." Tears filled Amara's eyes and she nodded. "I'd like that," she whispered. As Michael hugged his daughter for the second time, he silently promised himself, and her, that he would do whatever it took to make up for lost time. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions, challenges, and moments Michael never thought he'd experience. As he began spending time with Amara, the vast distance between their worlds became increasingly apparent. For all his years of discipline and training, Michael was entirely unprepared for the delicate work of building trust with a little girl who had known so much loss. Their first outing was a trip to a nearby park. Michael had packed a small picnic, complete with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, juice boxes, and a blanket he'd borrowed from the base. Amara sat quietly in the back seat during the drive, clutching her stuffed bunny, a worn, floppy-eared toy that Michael learned had been her comfort during her mother's illness. As they walked toward a shaded patch of grass near the playground, Michael tried to bridge the silence. "So, Amara, what do you like to do? Any favorite hobbies?" Amara shrugged, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I like to read," she mumbled. "Reading, huh?" Michael said, trying to sound upbeat. "That's great. What kind of books do you like?" She hesitated, then glanced at him. "Fairy tales. Mama used to read them to me at night." Michael's chest tightened at the mention of Camille. He smiled gently, determined not to let the moment slip. "Well, maybe you can read me one someday. I bet you're a great storyteller." Amara's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, but it quickly disappeared. She sat down on the blanket, carefully keeping her distance from Michael. As they ate, Michael told her stories about his childhood, how he'd grown up in a small town, fishing in the creek with his brother, and dreaming of becoming a soldier like his father. Amara listened intently, though her expression remained guarded. After lunch, Michael suggested they check out the playground. Amara hesitated but eventually agreed, climbing onto the swings while Michael gave her a gentle push. For the first time that day, he heard her laugh, a soft musical sound that made his heart swell. "Higher, Daddy," she giggled, the words slipping out before she realized what she'd said. Michael froze, his hand still gripping the chains of the swing. It was the first time she had called him Daddy, and the weight of it hit him like a freight train. His eyes stung with tears, but he quickly blinked them away, not wanting to overwhelm her. "You got it, sweetheart," he said, pushing the swing a little higher. For the rest of the afternoon, the gap between them seemed to shrink. Amara's laughter became more frequent, and Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years: joy, pure and unfiltered. But it wasn't always easy. Back at Tanya's apartment, Amara's walls would go back up, her demeanor guarded and distant. She struggled to fully trust Michael, and he couldn't blame her. He was a stranger who had suddenly appeared in her life, promising to be the father she had always dreamed of. But dreams, as Amara had learned, didn't always come true. One evening, as Michael prepared to leave after a visit, he overheard Amara talking to Tanya in her room. "What if he leaves too?" Amara asked softly, her voice trembling. "What if he doesn't want me anymore?" Michael's heart broke. He had thought his presence would be enough, but he realized now that it wasn't just about showing up. It was about proving, over and over, that he was here to stay. Next morning, Michael made a decision. He called Tanya and asked if he could take Amara to his base for the day. He wanted her to see his world, to understand who he was and why he had been absent for so long. Tanya agreed, though she warned him to tread carefully. At the base, Amara's eyes widened as she took in the towering gates, the rows of tanks, and the soldiers marching in perfect formation. Michael walked beside her, explaining everything in simple terms. "This is where I've been all these years," he said. "It's a big responsibility, and sometimes it took me away from things I didn't even realize I was missing. but I don't want to miss anything with you anymore." He introduced her to some of his fellow soldiers, who greeted her warmly and showed her how to salute. Amara giggled as one of the soldiers playfully taught her how to march, her small frame comically imitating the rigid steps of a drill. Later, Michael took her to his quarters, where he showed her his collection of medals, photographs, and keepsakes from his deployments. One photo in particular caught her eye. A picture of Michael as a young soldier, standing in a dusty village with a group of children surrounding him. "Who are they?" Amara asked, pointing to the kids in the photo. "They're kids I met during a mission overseas," Michael explained. "They didn't have much, but they were so kind and full of life. They reminded me that no matter how tough things get, there's always hope." Amara studied the photo for a long time, then looked up at him. "Were you scared?" Michael knelt beside her, his tone gentle. "Sometimes. But I always told myself that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going, even when you are." Amara seemed to take his words to heart. She reached out and held his hand, her small fingers wrapping tightly around his. "You're really brave, Daddy," she said softly. Michael felt a lump in his throat. "And so are you, sweetheart," he said, "braver than I could ever be." As they left the base that evening, Amara seemed lighter, her smile more genuine. Michael knew they still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly starting to build something. A bond that no distance, time, or pain could break. Michael woke up earlier than usual the following week, the rising sun casting soft golden rays through the blinds of his modest on-base apartment. Today was different. He wasn't heading out for training or preparing for deployment. Today he was finally taking the step he had been avoiding, confronting Camille's absence and acknowledging the pain he had caused by not being there for Amara sooner. After weeks of bonding with Amara, Michael realized that while their time together had brought moments of joy, a silent heaviness still lingered in her small shoulders. She carried questions, fears, and the weight of a mother's memory that Michael barely knew how to honor. He wanted to be there for her. But first, he needed to face what he had walked away from all those years ago. Later that morning, Michael drove to a small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Amara sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands clutching her stuffed bunny like it was a lifeline. Tanya had suggested this visit would help them both, though Michael wasn't sure if he was ready. The cemetery was peaceful, lined with rows of weathered gravestones and blooming wildflowers. Michael parked the car and stepped out, his chest tightening as he glanced over at Amara. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Amara nodded, though her eyes were glossy. "I come here sometimes with Aunt Tanya," she said. "But it's different now. Because you're here." They walked side by side, their footsteps crunching softly against the gravel. Amara led the way to a modest headstone, tucked beneath the shade of an oak tree. It was adorned with fresh daisies and a small photo of Camille, her radiant smile frozen in time. Michael knelt beside the grave, his heart aching as he stared at the name etched in the stone. Camille Richards. The memory of her laughter, her warm eyes, and the brief but beautiful time they had shared came rushing back like a flood. He had never allowed himself to grieve her, and now, seeing her final resting place, the weight of his choices pressed down on him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Camille. I should have been there. For you." For her, Amara stood silently beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder. Tears streamed down Michael's face as he reached out to touch the gravestone. "I didn't know about her," he said softly, "but I should have fought harder to stay in your life. You deserved better than me disappearing like I did." Amara knelt beside him, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Mama used to talk about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said you were brave and kind, and that you had to go because you were helping people. She told me you loved her." Michael's breath caught in his throat. "I did," he said, looking into Amara's tear-filled eyes. "I loved her more than I could ever say. And I love you too. I wish I could have been there for you both, but I promise you, Amara, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Amara leaned into him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. They sat there together in the quiet, surrounded by the stillness of the cemetery, as father and daughter began to release the pain of the past and make room for healing. The visit to the cemetery became a turning point for Michael. In the days that followed, he noticed subtle changes in Amara. She seemed lighter, more open, and less guarded around him. She even started calling him Daddy more often, her voice carrying a sense of certainty and warmth each time she said it. But there were still shadows to confront, particularly the lingering effects of Camille's death and the challenges Amara faced as a young black girl navigating a world that often felt unkind. One evening, as they sat on the couch in Tanya's living room, Amara asked a question that stopped Michael in his tracks. "Daddy," she began hesitantly, "why do people treat me different because of my skin?" Michael's chest tightened as he searched for the right words. He knew this was a conversation Camille likely had with her, but now it was his responsibility to guide her through it. "Well, sweetheart," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people don't understand what makes each of us unique, and when people don't understand, they can act unfairly or say things that hurt. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. You're perfect just the way you are." Amara tilted her head, her expression serious. "Mama used to say my skin is like hers, and it's beautiful," she said quietly. "But sometimes kids at school say mean things, and it makes me feel small." Michael's heart broke at her honesty. He reached out and took her hand. "Amara, your mama was right. Your skin, your hair, everything about you is beautiful. And don't let anyone make you feel small. You're strong, just like she was. And I'm here to remind you of that every single day." Tanya, who had been listening from the kitchen, stepped in with a soft smile. "You're already doing great, Michael," she said. "Just keep showing her that love. That's all she needs." Michael knew his journey as a father was far from over. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove to Amara that he was here to stay. Slowly but surely, they were building a foundation of trust, love, and resilience. One that could withstand the complexities of their past and the uncertainties of their future. Little did Michael know, the greatest test of their bond was just around the corner. The sun had just begun to rise on a crisp Saturday morning when Michael's phone buzzed with an urgent call. He glanced at the screen. It was Tanya. Anxiety gripped his chest as he picked up. "Tanya, what's wrong?" A voice trembled on the other end. "Michael, it's Amara. She's missing." Michael felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. "What do you mean missing?" he demanded, already reaching for his jacket. "She ran off," Tanya explained, her voice breaking. "We got into a small argument about school. She's been struggling, Michael. Kids have been teasing her again, and she's been bottling it up. I tried to talk to her, but she got upset and left. I think she went to the park where Camille used to take her." "I'm on my way," Michael said, his voice firm but shaky. As he raced through the quiet streets, Michael's mind was a whirlwind of fear and guilt. He had promised Amara he would always be there for her, but he hadn't realized just how much she was still carrying. The thought of her wandering alone, feeling lost and unloved, made his chest ache. When Michael arrived at the park, he spotted Amara sitting alone on a swing, her head bowed and her small hands clutching the chains. Relief swept over him, but it was quickly replaced by the overwhelming urge to make things right. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Amara," he called softly. She looked up, her tear-streaked face breaking his heart. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just didn't know where else to go." Michael knelt in front of her, his hands resting gently on her small shoulders. "Amara, you never have to be sorry for how you feel," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But you don't have to face this alone either. I'm here, baby. I'm here for all of it. The good, the bad, and everything in between." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "I just miss Mama," she sobbed. "She always knew what to say. She made me feel safe." Michael held her tightly, his own tears falling silently. "I miss her too," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know I'll never replace her, but I promise I'll do everything I can to make you feel safe and loved. Always." They sat there for a long time, the cool morning air wrapping around them as they clung to each other. Slowly, Amara's breathing steadied, and her grip on Michael loosened. Later that evening, back at Tanya's apartment, Michael decided it was time to address Amara's struggles head-on. He gathered her and Tanya in the living room, holding a small scrapbook he had been working on. "Amara," he began, placing the book on the coffee table. "I know it's been hard. Losing your mom, dealing with school, and having me show up out of nowhere. It's a lot. But I want you to know that you're not alone. We're a team now. Amara looked at him curiously as he opened the scrapbook. Inside were photos of Camille, some from the days Michael had spent with her, and others Tanya had shared. There were also pictures of Michael's family, his parents, and even snapshots of Amara from their recent outings together. "I want you to know where you come from," Michael said, his voice warm. "This is your story, our story. It's full of love, resilience, and strength. And it's just beginning." Amara flipped through the pages, her small fingers tracing the edges of the photos. When she reached a page filled with handwritten notes from Michael, her eyes widened. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the words. "That's my promise to you," Michael said. "I wrote down all the things I want to be for you. Your protector, your biggest fan, your teacher, and most importantly, your dad." Tears welled in Amara's eyes as she closed the scrapbook and looked up at him. "You really mean it?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Michael nodded, pulling her into a hug. "With all my heart." Over the next few weeks, Michael doubled down on his commitment to Amara. He began attending her school meetings, helping her with homework, and teaching her to stand up for herself. One afternoon, he surprised her by bringing her to a self-defense class on the base, where she learned how to protect herself while building confidence. Amara started to blossom. Her once guarded demeanor began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that radiated through her smile. She made new friends, excelled in her schoolwork, and even joined the local kids' soccer league. Through it all, Michael stood by her side, cheering her on, and reminding her every day that she was never alone. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Amara turned to Michael with a thoughtful expression. "Daddy," she said, "do you think Mama would be proud of us?" Michael looked at her, his heart swelling with love. "I know she would," he said, his voice steady. "She'd be so proud of you, of how strong, kind, and brave you are. And I hope she'd be proud of me too." Amara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think she is." In that moment, Michael realized just how far they had come. From the uncertainty of their first meeting to the unbreakable bond they now shared, they had built something extraordinary. A family rooted in love, resilience, and hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the porch, Michael held Amara close, silently promising her, and himself, that he would never let her feel alone again. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And together, they were unstoppable.